In this guide, we're going to build out our React registration component, and we're going to communicate with our Rails API. Now, the very first thing that we need to do is to start up the Rails server. But as you might have noticed, React by default runs on port 3000. Rails also by default runs on port 3000. So what we can do is add in a flag to our API to say, I want you to run on a different port. So let's start by doing that. If you open up the terminal where your Rails application is, make sure you're in the root of that application, type Rails s-p, and then give a different port number. In this case, I'm just going to say 3001. Type return, and then this is going to start up the Rails server, and it's going to start it and run it on port 3001, and that way we're not going to have a conflict with both ports being on the same location. Obviously this isn't an issue in production, but for right now it would be. So while that starts up, let's talk about what we need to do in React. So I'm going to start by creating a new file. So if you go into components, right click, and I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to say auth/ and then registration.js. This is something kind of cool in Visual Studio Code. If you create a new file and pass in a slash, it'll auto generate a directory. So if I type return now, you'll see it created a auth directory and then created this registration file. So let's create a React class component. So I'm going to say that this component is called registration, and then we're going to be calling this from the home component, but we can wait to call it here in a minute. So I'll say registration, and then it goes here. Hit save, and just to make sure this is working, let me close out these other files we don't need right now. And inside of home, let's pull in that registration component. So I'll say registration, auto import it. We're not going to pass in any props right now, and just hit save. If you go to the browser and then navigate to home, you should see something that says registration. Yes, so registration goes here. So that is working well. Let's check in on the terminal, and yes, it looks like our server with our Rails API is up and running. So we are good to go with communicating with that API. And now let's start building out our registration component. If you've never worked with forms, or you've had limited experience working with forms in React, this might seem a little bit convoluted. It actually takes quite a bit of work to get a basic form working in React, but that's what we're going to work through in this entire guide. So I'm going to start by passing in a constructor. So I'm going to create a constructor. It'll take in props, and then I will call super so that we have access to all of the component attributes and methods. And now we need to define a base state. So I'm going to say this dot state is equal to the object of an email, which is going to start off as an empty string, a password, which is also going to start off with an empty string, a password confirmation, which will also start off with an empty string, and then let's also check and have a base state for any registration errors. And so registration errors, that's going to start off as an empty string. So with all of that in place, what we can do now is start to build up this form. So inside of the div, get rid of that placeholder text there, and let's start building this out. You can wrap your return statement inside of parens, and I always have Prettier installed, so as soon as I hit save, it's going to reformat everything for us. And now let's create a form. So I'm going to say form. It will have a onSubmit handler, and then I'm going to create a method called this.handleSubmit, and it's not going to take in any arguments or anything like that. And since we have this, we might as well at least add a placeholder for it. So in the constructor, type this.handleSubmit equals this.handleSubmit, and we'll bind it to this. And then we'll add a placeholder called handle submit. And by default, handle submit will get an event. So for right now, we don't have to do anything. We can just console log and say form submitted, and then make sure that we call event.prevent default so that the form doesn't actually try to behave like an HTML form. We simply want this method to be called. So now with that all in place, after our handle submit, now we can close off our form tag, and then everything that we're going to be writing is going to go inside of it. So let's add just a regular text tag. So we're going to create a input tag, and we have to add a few properties to this. The first one, let's say that we want this to be email, so we get some nice automatic validations with HTML. And then we have to give it a name property, which will also be of email. And we'll add a placeholder, so we don't have to do a label or anything like that. That can be anything that you want. And then the value, this is going to be equal to this.state.email. And then we also need an onChange handler. So for this, we'll say onChange equals this.handle change, which is a method we haven't created yet, but we will in a second. And then let's also make this required, and we can close out our input tag. Now we might as well go to handle change and bind that to this. This.handle change equals this.handle change bind to this, and then actually call the method. So I'll say handle change, we'll take in the event, and then for right now, let's just console log it. So console log, handle change, print out the event, and that's all we need to do there. Hit save, and Prettier will make that much cleaner and easier to read. And now we can just copy this. So we have this input of email. The next two are going to be for password. So we have password. The name will be password. And this name, as I'm going to show you here in a moment, is very important. And so it's important you type it like that. And then the value is going to be of type password. Handle change is going to be the same method, and that is required as well. So let's now copy that input. And our last input tag here is the name is going to be password confirmation. The type is still password. And for the placeholder, we can say password confirmation, and value has to be password confirmation. Now with all that in place, we can create a button. And for right now, this button can just say register. Okay, and also make sure this is of type submit. Okay, there's a decent amount of code, but let's go test this out and make sure it's working in the browser. So I'm going to open this up, and if I just type in anything, so I'll say my name, and you can see handle change worked right there. We got a synthetic event down in the console. Now you may be curious, why did my name disappear? Well, if you're relatively new to React, then it's because we haven't updated the state value. And so if you look back at the code, you'll see the value, which is what is shown inside of that element. The value is set to this.state and then the attribute name. Well, we haven't changed that. By just typing something in, it doesn't actually go and change the state value. We need to do that manually, which is what we'll do here in a moment. Well, let's make sure our onSubmit handler is working. So if I click register, well, actually, all of our validations are going to block that from happening. So we'll test that out in a moment after we've updated this. So let's scroll all the way up. So inside of handle change, what we can do here is we can update our state value. So I'm going to say this dot set state, and now inside of here we can't hard code anything in. We wouldn't want to say, okay, if this is a password, then set the password value. That wouldn't really be a great way of doing it. Instead, what we can do is we can call the event target.name. So what this is going to do is it's going to come down into the input and it's going to pick up the name. And that's why I told you it was so important that this lines up, because we need to have a direct mapping between the name attribute here and whatever the listing is in state. So that is going to set that state value dynamically. When it's an email, it'll say email. When it's password confirmation, it'll say password confirmation. And now inside of here, we'll say event.target.value. Now with that in place, now that should actually work. So I'm going to hit save here. And if you come to your email tag, type it out, now you can see it works. And if you type a password in, that works as well. You can see it's all logged in state because the value is working. And I'm also going to zoom in just so you can see this a little bit better. There we go. That's better. And now if I click register, you'll see it says form submitted. So far, so good. Everything is coming along nicely. Now what we need to do is have all of the data from the form sent up to our Rails API. So that is what our handle submit function is going to do. So now let's import Axios, because we need to communicate with an outside API. So I'm going to say import Axios from Axios. And now we can go inside of handle submit and actually call our Rails API. So for this, I'm going to want a lot of room because this is going to be a decent amount of code. So I'm going to say Axios and then .post, because we're going to make a post request here. And this is going to be going to https:// and then this is on localhost 3001, because that's the port we're running on, and then registrations. And if you're curious on how to know that, in Rails, you have the ability to simply run your rake routes function. So rake routes will give you a listing of all of the available routes that you have in your API, and you'll see that we have one that is simply /registrations for creating a new account. Whenever rake routes decides to run, I'll just keep typing and we'll come back and check that in a moment. I have a few things running on my system, so it's a little bit slower at the moment. So that is the registrations. Now, the next two things I'm going to show you are absolutely critical. So for Axios Post, it's going to take in 3 arguments. First argument is the API endpoint to hit. That is what we have here with registrations. The next is the data that we're wanting to send in the post request. So that's going to be our user data, our email and our password and password confirmation. And those need to be passed in as an object. So I'm going to give the second argument here as an object, and now we need to structure the object. And if you want a little hint on this, and you can see the registrations are there. If you look, we have a registrations post request, which is /registrations. But now let's take a look at the way we need to structure the data, just in case it's been a little while since you've watched the API videos. If you go to the app and then controllers registrations controller, this expects a structure where we have a nested user. So we're going to have a parent user object, which is going to have the email, the password, and password confirmation all nested. And so that's very important to keep in mind, because that means we need to structure the data we send the same way. So here I'm going to say user and pass in a nested object that's going to include the email, which is going to call this .state.email, and then the password, which will be call this .state.password, and then the password confirmation, which will call this .state.password confirmation. And yes, if you're familiar with React and JavaScript, you could also use destructuring here at the very top, and then you could just call email, password, and password confirmation. So you could say something like const, and then pull in each of those attributes. So email, password, and then password confirmation. And then from there, just pull that from this .state. And then you can now, inside of your API call, just call those attributes by themselves. It's a little bit easier to read and easier to see. Okay, so that's the second argument, is the data, which has to be passed as an object. So make sure you wrap in that user with the curly brackets. And then the third option that you have to send, and I can promise you this, when I was originally teaching myself how to build authentication between a JavaScript front-end app and a Rails app, this was the most confusing part, because there was one time where I forgot this one tiny snippet of code, and I thought I was going crazy because the system looked like it would work, it would have no errors, but it wouldn't actually set the cookie, and so nothing was actually persistent. And so what that flag is here. So you have the first item, which is registrations, the next one, which is the data, then you need to give a comma here and give a third argument. This is going to be another object, which is with credentials true. If you only remember this one thing from this video, is never forget to put that third argument of with credentials true. That is what tells the API that it is okay to set that cookie in our client. Without that, it won't have permission to do it. It's not going to be set, and then you're going to be able to be in this in-between state where you've created a user or you've logged them in technically, but then the cookie won't be inside of the browser, so it will look like the user is not logged in, and it'll be very confusing. So make sure you always remember to include that. And those are the three items that get passed into the post request, and then from there we need to say, okay, what happens then? Because Axios returns a promise, and in that case we want to take that response, and for this guide we're simply going to console log it out to see if the user is logged in or not. So this will be registration response, and we'll take that response and just view it in the console. And then if there are any errors, we want to catch those. So if there are any errors, we want to console log a registration error and then view the error. Okay, that was a mouthful. That was a decent amount of code, but that is actually everything you need in order to create a user on the API, which is pretty cool. So let's test this out now. So I'm going to open up the terminal. So I'm going to go to our Rails app, and let's start up the Rails console so that we can look for users. And then also here, make sure you give a refresh on the page, and let's test this out. I'm going to create a user called 03/14/19/1. It's just the date today. And then we'll say at dev.com, give a password and a password confirmation, both of ASDF. And now let's click register. Oh, and it looks like we have a little error. Let's see, what is it? We have a network error. Let's go test this out at localhost. Do I have everything spelled correctly? 3001 registrations, yes. And let's go to the terminal and see what the error is. Okay, yes, it says malformed request, Puma, HTTP parsing fails. Okay, let's see. Oh, and you know what? I think I know the issue. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code. And yes, the issue was I typed HTTPS. Hit save, and let's try this one more time. Okay, try this user. And the reason for that is because localhost isn't on HTTPS, so it's going to throw an error for that. Clear out the console, type register, and there we go. That worked. So if you open this up, you can see the data we get back is a status of created, and we also get back a user object. Now the cool thing about this is our Rails user object. This is not just data we sent up. This is Rails taking that data, creating a record in the database, and then creating its own JSON response and passing it back to us. The cool thing about this is that you can have your Rails API do anything else that you want it to do. It could do something such as adding a default role or any kind of business rules or logic that you want, and then you can wrap all of that data up and send it back to React, and then React can react accordingly. Okay, so that is working beautifully. And if you look up the terminal here and go back to the Rails console, if you type user.last, you'll see that is the user we just created. So I know that video is pretty long and we went through quite a few topics, but let's do a quick review. We created a registration component. We called that from the home component, from that home page, and then we built up a class component that had a state with the email, the password fields, and then it had two handler events, two event handlers. One for taking in and updating state whenever a user is filling out the form, and then one for what happens when the form is submitted. In this case, it goes and hits the API endpoint for registering a user, and then for right now, we are just console logging that out. So great job if you went through that. In the next guide, we're going to extend the data flow out. So we're going to be able to see what happens and how we can pass data between the registration component, the home component, and even redirect users, because the behavior we're looking for is I want to be able to register a user and have them auto redirected to the dashboard. And so we're going to do that in the next guide.